Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar organized by the Swedish Institute and the Department of Strategic Communication at Lund University. The topic for today's webinar is reputational security, and we are delighted to be joined by Nick Cull, Professor of Communication at the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism at the University of Southern California. Professor Cull is a historian with a special interest in the role of mass communication in foreign policy. And today he will talk with Dr. James Pamment, Associate Professor of Strategic Communication at Lund University, about their research on national reputation as a security risk. Thereafter, we will be joined by the Deputy Director General for the Swedish Institute, Anna Rudels, and Director General of the Psychological Defense Agency, Henrik Landerholm, who will discuss this and what this means in a Swedish context. Finally, we open up for questions from you in the audience. You can pose questions anytime you'd like through the Q&A function, or via the chat, and we will pick them up afterwards. But now I give the word to James and Nick. Please.
Thank you. Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you for organizing this, and what a pleasure it is to be here. Nick, can I begin by asking you a question?
Sure.
What is reputational security?
Well, I see reputational security as the parts of security that come from reputation, and this can both be advantages that are enjoyed by an international actor, or it can be vulnerabilities. And why I think the concept is particularly useful is because, unlike soft power, which always emphasizes the benefits and leverage, reputational security, I think, directs attention to weaknesses and to vulnerabilities and liabilities even. So it isn't purely a communicative concept as a policy concept. It could also have you think about things you should stop doing as well as things you should start doing and do and say more.
Now, Sweden's usually seen as one of the winners in the soft power competition. Does it have an issue with reputational security? Is it something that Sweden needs to start looking at? Is it something that it should be spending more time and resources on working with?
Well, I think that it's essential to see the issue of international image through the lens of reputational security because of this attention to vulnerability. And it's quite clear that the reputation of Sweden is under attack, that the reputation of the Nordic countries in general are under attack. And unless you have some kind of response to the attacks on the reputation of the country and the region, I think that would be a major policy mistake. So, you know, that's the first implication of the policy for Sweden. But going on from that, you maintain a good reputation by continuing to do the things that gave you a positive reputation in the first place. So you have to think of it this way: you have to pay rent on a positive position in the world, and that means continuing to deliver on in the long term on things like contributions to the global common good. The other thing that I'd say is that I don't see reputational security as being a unilateral concept. Soft power has always been talked about as being this advantage that accrues to one country in particular, a way in which you know, France can pull ahead of Germany or vice versa. And I see reputational security as allowing us to explore common vulnerabilities. And where a way of life or a system of government shared between many countries is under attack, I think that we can conceptualize pushback in terms of a collective reputational security. And I'm not saying this to propose policies, but rather to recognize policies that are already in place and say the things that are already being done, for example, by the Swedish Development Agency in supporting democratic growth and resilience in the Western Balkans, partnering with free media in a region where it's really endangered. I mean, that is helping to remove a vulnerability for a way of life. And I see that as being part of reputational security and incredibly important. And so, you know, I can see here that part of what I'm suggesting is an exercise in renaming. But I think it's an important process to go through, an important framework to use, because it makes it clear that image, the kind of work done by the Swedish Institute, is not just a little extra. It's not just the top layer on the cake. It's part of the whole cake. It's part of the entirety of how a state stays safe and how the values that we hold dear stay safe in the 21st century. And maybe it's always been part of that, but it's a way of making the link explicit. And too often, the link is never made, or is only made in a minor way. And we see the work of international projection of image and public engagement as being a little extra, something to do once all the other policies have been decided. Oh, let's call in the cultural diplomats, and I don't see it that way. I don't see it that way.
Do you see any risks with this, Nick? You're touching on lots of different actors who could be doing this work, and we have two representatives here. You know, Henrik is responsible for a security agency, whereas Anna is responsible for an agency that's doing cultural work, trade promotion, image. Is there a problem with bringing in different agencies with different tasks and asking them all to contribute to security? Does that open up to some new risks?
Well, to me, that's dwarfed by the risks of doing nothing and of ignoring the whole field. Of course, whenever you're collaborating, you need to have a conversation and listen to each other and get to know the overlaps and the contrasting approaches to the same question. And I think probably the hardest thing in this field is to look at the way in which there are deficits in the way in which what the critics say is correct, the way in which your vulnerabilities or shortcomings as a state or a society are creating genuine avenues of attack for your detractors. So a good example of this, and to me, a really clear case of reputational security at work, is the process that Eisenhower and Kennedy went through in the United States, where they were under attack from the Soviet Union because of American racism. And the Soviet media daily, globally, made clear that the promises of the United States system could not be genuine if there was second-class citizenship for people of African origin. And Eisenhower's response to this and Kennedy's response to it was not to deny it, but rather to address it in policy and to say the United States, for Cold War reasons, has to accelerate the evolution of its civil rights process, that the federal government has to get involved in civil rights reform. So you could say that one of the greatest advances of American reputational security was to actually remove or downplay a reputational vulnerability, and to change a reality, not an image, but a reality, and then to talk about the ways in which that reality was changing. Now, that's a different process from what we understand in terms of let's put a great pavilion into an expo, or let's send out some wonderful documentary movies, or a jazz band, or something like that. And again, I think what I'm doing is recognizing different elements in what has always happened in the world of public diplomacy and in international image, the politics around international image, diplomacy around international image, rather than creating new recommendations. I'm just recognizing previous dynamics that have always been there.
So how actively should a country pursue this reputational security? Is it something that they should be going out online, talking to people, engaging with people, correcting them, seeking out misconceptions, or is it something?
I think that there are two levels. One is the policy debate within the country, when I hope it can strengthen the hand of people who want some things to change, who want to build a better reality, who want a policy initiative like, for example, more exchange students, or more attention to a particular positive, historically positive element of a country's behavior. So making sure that a country maintains its involvement with the UN, for example. So I would say that Canada, under the Harper government, if it was engaging in policies that would have damaged Canadian reputational security, if they had been sustained long enough for the world to have noticed, that luckily a decade of neglecting global citizenship isn't quite enough for the world to notice. But part of this is a way of changing the debate or sharpening the debate around particular policies. But the other part of it is saying that work overseas, the collective work, actually goes to foreign policy priorities, and to say that the work internationally that's being done by the Swedish Institute or by the Development Agency in terms of advancing values is very important, and not just a little side issue or bonus that Sweden's contributing. But the bottom line here is that this has to be about realities and making genuine contributions. And I think international audience is one thing I see from, if you really drill down into the this business of international reputation, you can see international audiences are pretty good at cutting through the superficial and getting to the heart of whether a country is doing what it needs to do, is making a good contribution in the world. And there's a good overlap between what Sweden is actually doing and Sweden's reputation in the world. So I would hope that can be sustained.
I'm really struck by this point you're making, that it's about reality and making a better reality. But for many civil servants, I'm sure they feel that they're working towards a better reality and would love to contribute. But we had an election here just very recently, and it's very much the job of the politicians to build that better reality within the country. So if you're a civil servant, if you're in Henrik's or Anna's place, how do you do something now, tomorrow? If they're totally convinced by your argument and now buy into reputational security as a key concept, what are the first steps? What are the absolute key things that can be done in practice tomorrow?
Well, I think first thing to do is what they're already doing, which is talk to each other and to understand the extent to which their fields are related. And also make sure that the Treasury understands that they're related, because the really important part of this concept is to make our world of reputation, public diplomacy, understandable and to the people who pay for government activity, so that it isn't this side thing. So number one thing is speak to each other and understand and explore the interlinkages in the work that's already going on.
And who would be the main audiences for any projects or any work that they start doing?
Well, that's a good question, and I think that the Swedish Institute already has a good sense of its audiences, which tend to be, I don't want to speak here for Anna, but my sense is that the Institute understands that its audiences are people who already have influence, or people who are going to have influence within a society. So it's always looking to build relationships with emerging with elites rather than with ordinary people. But I think that's an appropriate strategy, because trying to reach absolutely everybody is beyond the capacity of a single government agency, operating overseas especially. But I think that we also need to think of audiences in terms of geography, and making sure that the regions that are of most interest to Sweden are being properly served. And obviously there's a special role for Swedish Institute in the Baltics, and I would hope that would continue, because there are tremendous vulnerabilities in the Baltics, just so relatively near at hand.
Great, thank you, Nick. I see that we've used up our 20 minutes.
That went quickly.
And I think this is probably a good moment then to bring in our two general directors and make the conversation a bit more specifically about Sweden and how they view Sweden in this area. So perhaps I could start by asking what you see as Sweden's strengths in terms of reputational security, as Nick has described it. Who would like to begin? Please.
You just unmute my phone. I could start if Anna is not.
Go ahead.
Tina. Well, I have not spent my life as the Director General of the Psychological Defense Agency. I took up that position January the 1st, and our task is pretty limited in this respect. We are defending Sweden against adversaries, against action, information, influence, with an intention to cause harm to our country and in our country, and only linked to foreign actors, state actors, or non-state actors. That should be remembered. But many of the mechanisms are the same, and my experiences are to a large extent built on my 10 years as a foreign service officer. So I've been selling Swedish reputation in Afghanistan, in Riga, Latvia, as well as in the Gulf, where I spent the last 4 years as the Swedish ambassador in Abu Dhabi. And there is an ongoing struggle there every day. The Baltics, as Professor Karl mentioned, very specific. The Russian pressure towards the Baltic states in particular is very strong. And the defamation and disinformation campaigns regarding the West in general, and Nordic countries that are perceived by the Baltics to a large extent as ideals, are of course very important targets for such active disinformation campaigns. And it is from time to time a tough task. The cooperation between embassies and the Swedish Institute is regularly very good, but the Swedish Institute is a headquarters-based organization in Stockholm, while the embassies are sort of doing the stuff out in the field. And there is still a lot to do in this area, because the image of Sweden is very, very different in different parts of the world. I mean, the markets I worked in, Afghanistan, Riga, and the Gulf, you can easily understand that sort of the challenges are very different. Moving over to the issue of security, yes, of course, it has immediate links. When I served in Afghanistan, the Swedish development aid assistance, mainly through the Swedish Committee for Afghanistan, SAC, or Svenska Afghanistan-kommittén, was of course crucial to the reputation of Sweden. It was easy to sell a benign country supporting another during good times and bad times, having been active since 1982. An incredible advantage which we could base on decades of development assistance. In Riga, I would say more or less the same, due to the strong Swedish support for Latvian sovereignty during the 90s, where many different agencies, state agencies, and local and regional agencies supported the Latvian state building process, including military aspects, for a very long time. And of course, this created a base of a good reputation. Abu Dhabi, where I served the last 4 years, was of course very different, and the Sweden image is in that part of the world so much weaker, so to speak. Positive, but with a very light footprint. And there are other areas that are general advantages for Sweden. I mean, the Swedish model of a positive, benign welfare state, with the gender equality in the Middle East, also a sensitive topic, like LGBT issues, but still high level of tolerance, a peaceful country, a country that is perceived to be benign with relatively weak national interests, not biased, an honest broker, based on the humanitarian legacy, Folke Bernadotte, Dag Hammarskjöld, etc., etc. Should also be mentioned that in parts of the world, I do believe that our perceived neutrality that ceased to exist in practice in 1992 were also part of this sort of reputational security for us. In reality, many of these things have changed, and over the last 10 years, our problems with immigration, integration, and criminality has been explored by our adversaries to a very large extent, and not to speak about the wider narrative of the decadent West that is more or less destroying itself. Very clear and strong narrative from the Russian side, based on their national interests, at least the interests of the regime.
Yes, and I'll continue then after you. Thank you, Henrik. Just a few words about the Swedish Institute. We were founded in 1945 and you can say that Sweden early understood the value of reputational security, or soft power, what you want to call it. And that has been our core mission since then, has been to communicate about Sweden, but also to build the relations. As you were talking about, Nick, the relationship building activities we do are extremely important. That we reach out to young leaders, and we have cooperation with other countries, of course with Swedish embassies, but also with project owners in different parts of the world. So that has been the core business, so to say, for the Swedish Institute since 1945. And what is complex today, of course, it's the digital landscape, that things are happening so fast, and it's very, very polarizing. A few words about what than what Henrik gave the what you can see in different countries. But if you can kind of paint the overall picture about what's Sweden, the image of Sweden, so the general public in the world have a good perception, a general positive perception of Sweden, and it's associated with our strong governance, with democracy. It's a stable society, and also committed to climate and sustainability issues. And that also the point that it's so important for a country to show that it's acting. You cannot just talk, you have to act. And I think that's why also Sweden has a positive image, even though we are also not so well known everywhere. But we have a clear identity, which is positive for many people.
Great, thank you. Now you're both responsible for institutions that contribute to Swedish reputational security in different ways. Perhaps one is more leaning towards the security side and one more towards the reputational side, but still there's a connection there. How do you see your organization as contributing to reputational security? What are your main roles and contributions? Maybe Anna, you could start.
First, I mean, the very important thing, of course, is to understand how Sweden is perceived. What is the image of Sweden? So that's one leg that we stand on, which is very important, that we understand and that we listen, so that we can communicate about Sweden, the Swedish values, facts about Sweden, so we reach the right target groups and the future leaders of the world. Then also, that's more the reputational side. But of course, as also Nick talked about, the tip you gave us is the cooperation or samverkan, to use the very Swedish word, with other agencies, such as Myndigheten för psykologiskt försvar, is very important. So since you can't say it's only one area, it's a kind of grayscale area where you have to work together with the other agencies that have a different kind of mission than we have. So that I think that there we have, since Henrik's Angel started up in the 1st of January this year, we have had some heat during this year. And I mean, we're really working together, which works perfectly fine.
Yeah, I would like to underline what Anna said. Perhaps we hadn't perceived when we started our operations in early January that the Swedish Institute would be such a close partner for us. But since then, we've had weekly coordination where we benefit from the work regarding the Swedish Institute's analysis of how Sweden is perceived in different markets, which is an in-depth and very qualified analysis that benefits us, while we can share in-depth information in certain specific markets and also contribute with narratives and counter-narratives. And we have had several examples of this during the last 8.5 months now. The main issue being actually the largest information interference campaign that Sweden has experienced over the last decade. A very strong non-state actor pushed campaign against Swedish municipalities and their implementation of the Swedish legislation for how to take children into custody, given sort of family issues and abuse. A very strong campaign that had an impact in Sweden, mainly in minority groups, Muslims as they were targeted, but also was a struggle that we had to take outside Sweden. The Psychological Defense Agency is, of course, mainly a defense agency. So we contribute mainly to handle foreign interference in our country, but in our instruction, it also says that Swedish interests should also be defended, hence our close cooperation with the Swedish institutes also and the embassies also on foreign markets. how we handle things are not mainly from the perspective of reputational risks or security. They are more indirect. We do believe that a well-informed population in Sweden and well-informed decision makers at all levels in Sweden is an extremely important thing. That can be influenced also by how Sweden is perceived in foreign media and by foreign leaders. One issue that I've noticed after the elections in Sweden is that even though the image of Sweden has been slightly tarnished over the last few years, linked to sort of real societal problems as integration and criminality, we now see, and the issue of one of the specific parties, namely the Sweden Democrats, has been in the periphery of the focus of international media. After the elections, with the election result, that issue has sort of reached the surface in international media, and I would say the jury is still out regarding to what extent that will have any long-term impact on the image of our country. But these things are issues that have changed over the last 10 years regarding the image of Sweden that we didn't see before. And well, our job was easier those days because the image of Sweden is slightly more mixed nowadays than compared to what it was before.
Nick, I see you have a question.
Yeah. Well, what I wanted to do was go back to one of the things that you and I were talking about and then relate it to Anna and Henrik's conversation. And that is that sometimes reputational security requires a certain kind of diplomacy and particularly being honest with allies. And I think it was a very interesting moment in British reputational security when Britain decided that it was going to associate itself with a free media initiative. And that involved telling allies that it's not a good idea to put journalists in jail. And this is a particular issue in the Persian Gulf, where Henrik was ambassador. There are serious issues around UAE and neighboring countries, and to raise those as issues of reputational, there's a reputational security imperative in talking about the problems of our allies. I think that good allies have an ability to raise these questions, raise these problems. And the whole concept of reputational security, I think, provides a critique of some of the defenses against compromising on human rights. So to say, oh, we would love for human rights in our country, but we have to be secure first. And it's better to have journalists in jail than to have vulnerabilities in our media. And you have to say, but having journalists in jail is a tremendous vulnerability. And you're harming your security by doing this. So this is a sort of a long way around to saying that one of the priorities has to be to reconcile conventional diplomacy with the priorities around protecting the categories that are important to Sweden. And it's easy to see why we should be hard on our enemies and on our adversaries and talk about human rights and values with our enemies. But I'm saying we also need to be tough on our friends and have difficult conversations with our friends and not turn our blind eye to the shortcomings of our friends. And that's a harder thing to do, but I think it's very important because if you look at the way in which our adversary media works, it zooms in on hypocrisy and contradiction and whataboutism. And so the more we can do to eliminate the contradictions and the what's the right word? The genuine double standards. I think the better. So what I'm saying here is that part of it is ethical, and part of it is diplomatic. And I hope that this concept can strengthen the hand of people arguing for doing the right thing in a diplomatic context. So the old style diplomacy has to be part of this too.
Any comments on that, or I see we're nodding in agreement?
Yeah, I would nod in agreement. It is a fine balance. The closer allies you are, the more honest I think you must allow yourself to be. Not necessarily by openly, in all cases, criticize your allies. Some are more sensitive than others, but to keep your reputation sort of untarnished, you need to speak up for your basic values. That then can require that with allies, with sort of other opinions and other policies in that regard, you need to have sort of the full spectrum of relations to take into account, so that you not necessarily sort of you don't only do bashing, but you sort of build positive relations simultaneously. That is, I mean, particularly important. But sort of shutting up because you're allies and want to keep that sort of alignment without problems. I agree with Professor Kahl that this includes reputational risks, perhaps more for Sweden than for many other countries, that we have, due to the fact that we have so strongly been linked to the issue of actually speaking up on issues regarding humanitarian issues as well as human rights issues. So we have a legacy to take into account and to take care of in that sense.
Another perspective on that, which is not directly diplomatic, but what we do, the Swedish Institute, we are in charge of the Sweden's digital official digital communications in Arabic and English and Russian. And of course, our followers, many of them are very interested in Sweden, and they demand answers. If Sweden does something, we need to kind of be transparent and give an honest answer. So that's also what's very important with the digital communication, that you can provide some kind of answer what Sweden is doing.
No, I agree very much. And sort of talking the talk is one thing, walking the walk is another. You better talk the walk, so to speak. But that also, it was an issue for me as an ambassador. It gives you a responsibility to actually see the world as it is and see Sweden as it is too. I mean, we would be perhaps perceived as sort of the very benign actor independently, but our strength and our reputation is very much linked to factors that we do not always promote that much. For example, our industrial base, the big brands that not only on the entertainment side, but also on the industry side, that is, I would argue, as important as our democratic heritage, the perceived stability of our system, rule of law, human rights, and many other areas. Sort of, it is a package that has created Sweden's reputation and Sweden's soft power. Sometimes this is a fine balance, and some of you may remember there was it 15 years ago in the Justus Lipsus building, all different countries were given a piece of sort of art that an independent artist had created. Bulgaria, for some odd reason, was described by the artist as a sort of lavatory. I mean, awful, disgusting, and diminishing. Sweden, I must say, the artist had really found an interesting contradiction, because they had created a piece of art with a Gripen airfighter inside an IKEA package, which is not necessarily, of course, part of the Sweden image that we try to sell every day. But I must say, an extremely sort of smart way actually understanding the contradiction within our country, because when we are perceived, I mean, Sweden comes out very well in different indexes regarding how much we contribute to the world. And as I remember it in the last one, only sort of weapons export is one of the issues that's slightly where we are not top ranked. This is a fact for all industrial countries, and in particular for those who are active in the defense industry, which could be perceived by some as a strength in itself, because it's a connotation of a country that takes itself seriously, that takes its defense of its values and its territory seriously, and also have the innovative capability of doing something on one hand. On the other, by arms exports, of course, creating at least tentative problems in other countries. Sorry for being so long.
We touched upon the social services issue that happened earlier in the year, and as you said, Henrik, one of the largest attacks on Sweden, reputational attacks on Sweden, perhaps for decades. It's quite interesting, I think, when you have something that's based in reality, so something that affects your reputation. It's based on real people, real events, but at the same time, it's a known disinformation narrative. So Finland had also been attacked about children and how they're treated. Norway has also had it in the last few years. It's not a new thing for Sweden. So how do you weigh up when you're thinking about how to respond to this, how to protect Sweden's image? How much of it is actually about the reality and dealing with what's actually being said and what's being done? And how much of it is really just about understanding how the adversary is thinking and the fact that these are known disinformation narratives that can be used against anyone at any time, and they're opportunistic in their use? You're muted, Henrik.
I think your question is crucial, because the balance is to understand the adversary's narratives and intentions that are most often intentional and very malign, based on a certain methods and ways of handling disinformation and using our vulnerabilities, which is the other side, understanding our own vulnerabilities and understanding and being able to present and counter stories based partly on real vulnerabilities. I mean, in this particular case, yes, there was an overrepresentation of Muslim children taken into custody. On the other hand, there are many good arguments for that. These are the immigrants that arrived late in Sweden. It's very easy to understand that these parents, to an extent, have not internalized sort of the Swedish way of parenting, neither sort of ethically nor legally. Hence, the overrepresentation there is good arguments behind it. As all civil servants, we have limits. I mean, our narrative, we are allowed to create narratives, of course, but our narratives needs to be 100% truthful, and our narratives should also, in a wider sense, represent what is sort of reasonable description of reality. So we cannot counter disinformation sort of with the same sort of manipulative methods as our adversaries. But understanding and the thinking of the adversary is as important as being able to measure and evaluate our own vulnerabilities. So this is a two-way street.
Yes, and if I comment a little bit about the disinformation campaign also, so it is, as you all said, it's the biggest Sweden has noted, biggest in this disinformation campaign, and it was misleading from the start, which is other kind of campaigns we've seen or talks on Twitter. It has been not misleading from the start. And what's been interesting that it was so very one-dimensional on Twitter, where it was biggest. It was very, very negative, and they used hashtags very efficiently, and emotional visuals, and they stayed on track. They stayed on the message all the time. The positive thing was that the MPF was out quite early to comment on the campaign. So it gave in news media, you could see both perspectives, that there was a disinformation campaign, and also that you could see, I mean, all the negative things about children being kidnapped, so to say. But it points to that it's important that the different actors from the agency, that we are out talking about and communicating quite early to give different perspectives what's happening. What was challenging in this is that it's added to different political arenas. So it was the social services, but it took time before someone within politics commented on the issue. Since it was about security, we had a disinformation campaign going on also, and different aspects of the issue, which made it quite challenging and hard.
Great. Can I remind the audience to send in your questions? And I'll ask one more before we open up to the audience. Are there any areas that are upcoming? Obviously, we just had an election, so change of government, the NATO accession is in the process of happening. What are the sort of upcoming areas of importance over the next year or two that you see sort of on the horizon for you to deal with, or for Sweden's reputational security to cope with?
I would say that what we have seen at the Swedish Institute when we were following the image of Sweden, what's happening in the world, going back to 2020 with the start of Corona, and you had Sweden in the spotlight from a quite negative perspective in the beginning on the way Sweden handled things. I think to understand we have to be very thorough with our analysis to understand how Sweden is perceived, and we have to be fast in doing this kind of analysis, so we can communicate about what's happening. And then also, I think we have to be ready to act quite fast if something happens, as with this LVU campaign, which was in the beginning of the year. But of course, I mean, these are challenging, polarizing times. We have NATO, we have the election in Sweden. I mean, the question is big, James, I would say. So what we do, I mean, we have to be fast in what we see and how we act, and also reach out and work with other agencies to kind of get other perspectives that we don't have at the Swedish Institute.
I don't have much to add, actually, except for the basic fact that we have not only to be fast, we have to be prepared that our adversaries are able, willing, capable and willing to sort of explore and use any vulnerability there is. So it really doesn't matter if they find something where we are weak or perceived to be weak, or something that could be explored in a narrative that is hurting, creating polarization in our society, or tarnishing our reputation, that will be used sooner or later. That is our experience. And there are always, I mean, any society has vulnerabilities. Hence, we need to analyze them and be prepared for this. And part of the task my agency has is to prepare the whole society from this sort of individual and citizen level, the municipal, regional, and national level, so that authorities on different levels have a high level of awareness and a high level of preparedness. That is the most important part of a psychological defense.
Thank you. Now we have a question from Solomon in the audience, and I think he's very much touching on similar issues to what you were just describing. He says he would like to take this discussion to the organizational level. So far, what we know is that reputational security and risk comes from external factors such as media, public opinion, which means that organizations find it hard to put in control measures, if that would be the goal. What measures can organizations put in place? And I think that's what you were just touching on, to ensure that the reputational risk measures are there. So what kind of things can you start to do? And I think, as you were saying, be familiar with certain types of questions that come up. What else? What else would you be looking at doing?
I would say it's important, of course, that you understand the tactics of disinformation, and something that looks odd or different, you have to react to it. That's the easiest way to start, so to say.
Yeah, of course, you could sort of try to dissect the different parts of it. I mentioned awareness and preparedness, including tools and knowledge to be able to understand and identify disinformation, but also insights into own risks and vulnerabilities of external information impact, and very important, coordination between relevant actors, as the agency I lead, and as the Swedish Institute, the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, other ministries, embassies out in the world. This is nothing that one agency can manage by itself. We need a higher level of preparedness and a higher level of awareness. If we are able to based on that, coordinate our activities, I wouldn't say that we are home safe, but we are in a much better situation than before.
We have another question. Nick, this is addressed to you, although I think perhaps Anna and Henrik would also have some opinions on this. How efficient do you think Russian propaganda has been in damaging Sweden's reputation internationally?
Well, I think that first thing to say is that Sweden has a good reputation. And if you look at a measure like the Nation Brands Index, Sweden is always in the top 10, and that's a very impressive thing. However, if you look in particular places, for example, in the media that most picks up on Kremlin narratives, so I'm thinking in the United States of both right-leaning media and left-leaning media. It's one of the ironies of media today that the sort of the narratives you find in Sputnik crop up at the two ends of the political spectrum in the United States. There, Sweden is being questioned, and I think Sweden should take it in a way as a kind of backhanded compliment. It shows that the Swedish way of doing things, the welfare democracy is threatening to some ways of life around the world, some systems, and that they're singling it out for demonization. And it isn't just Russian media. I think it was significant when President Trump chose to start speaking about that thing that happened in Sweden. It showed the extent to which sort of Sweden was in some way on his map as a counter to some of the policies that he was backing, and showing Sweden has problems is a way of it's like saying, oh, the lifeboat's sinking. Look at that lifeboat, it's sinking. This is one of the great alternatives to so many of the policy extremes out there. And if it isn't working, that's I think of political consequence. So yes, I would see that these narratives are dangerous, even if they're not the dominant perception of Sweden yet. They are eroding in particularly vulnerable markets. But is that so? I don't see Sweden dropping out of the top 10 of most admired countries just because of targeting by Russia. But I do think this is a thing that Sweden has to take seriously. And so I'm very glad that Anna and Henrik are having this conversation and have the policy priorities that they do have.
Would anybody else like to jump in on that question?
I can just add on what Professor Karl says, that Sweden has been stable in the Nation Brands Index for many years, over 10 years. And as I started, the general perception of Sweden is positive. And that's also, it's because of how people perceive Sweden, but also how Sweden performs. And we perform quite well in different kind of indexes when it comes to innovation, to climate, and so on. But of course, you have to be aware of any sort of propaganda. And it's a little bit, when it comes to Donald Trump, it's a little bit easier when he's not on Twitter.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. May I make a comment that is more general? I mean, linked to sort of the hard security issues, reputation security can have an direct or indirect effect. I would argue that terrorism is definitely a threat that can increase due to a campaign like the one we experienced in January and February, because it installs an hostility towards our country based on ideas, on very clear narratives on the perception, the intended perception of Sweden being Islamophobic, being discriminating towards Muslims, etc. It could also lead to that establishment in certain allied countries over time sort of came into a position where there would be a lack of support for supporting Sweden. And the issues of internal cohesion and trust are applicable both to sort of our nation state as such, because polarization and diminishing cohesion and trust, which are basic values of the Nordic countries and very important for our societal models to actually function. If those diminishes and the gap between people, resilience and resistance against foreign adversaries would most likely decrease. Also, cohesion and trust in organizations of which we are participants or future participants, i.e. EU and NATO, could be impacted by reputation, if Sweden's reputation is highly affected through foreign malign information campaigns of different kinds. These are basic values, and as Anna indicated, it takes time to change perception. But since 2015, we have seen an intensified level of interference towards our Swedish interests outside of our country, as well as of trying to activities trying to affect also our population. That is very clear, and this will not go away anytime soon, as there are actors with intentions and capability, and I can assure you there are.
Great. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I think we've come to the end of our hour. So with that, thank you all for your participation, and I'll hand back to Cecilia.
Welcome.
Thank you, James and Nick and Anna and Henrik, for participating in this interesting seminar. And I'm sure we will continue to discuss, as always, these issues. If you would like to see this seminar again, you can go into inspa.se at the Institute for Public Affairs, Lund University. But for now, we say thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.